All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining the first of our two March PO calls. We have a rather light agenda for MCTTD today, so we might be done just a little bit early, just as a heads up to the Inhale team. And so the other call, if for your colleagues that may not be on today's call, is this coming Wednesday. And so if they weren't able to make it today, please let them know to come that day. So without further ado, this is our agenda for today. We're going to start out talking a little bit about the spring regional meetings. I know we've been talking about that for a while now, but just as final reminders, we'll talk a little bit about the endocrinology posters. It'll be a part of those spring regional meetings. We'll talk a little bit about the endocrinology and nephrology VBR scorecards that have gone out and that you should all hopefully be familiar with at this point. We'll talk about the EMR efficiency work group and the opportunities to participate in that. We'll talk about the quarterly PO reports, making sure that everybody has gotten those if there's any questions. We'll go through the upcoming MCTTD Learning Community event, and then take a peek at some of the enhancements that were made to the patient data dashboard for our March release at the end of the month. We'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're partnering with Michigan 211 on and the survey that we're going to send out, and talk about next steps as far as next month's meetings. All right, so as a reminder, our regional meeting registration is open. Spring regional meetings are in person and required for attendance by all three specialties: primary care, endocrinology, and nephrology. Going forward, spring, as you know, will continue to be held in person in the 7 regions, and fall, as of right now, will continue to be held virtually. Please make sure that your participating practices register by March 25th, and then that way we actually can make sure that we have final head counts to our venues in time. So the regional meetings are here. So as a reminder, we have 7 regions across the state. And so if you're in the Livonia Blue Jay region, your meeting is on April 8th. If you're in Badger Ann Arbor, you're on April 10th. In Troy area, you're on April 15th. If you're in Kalamazoo, you're on the 22nd of April. If you're in Grand Rapids, you're on the 23rd of April. If you're in the Bay City, Saginaw, Mid-Michigan region, you're on May 7th. And if you're up in Traverse City area, you're on May 8th. And the venues are at the bottom here. And within the registration link, when you do go to register, there will be specific information on the venue locations, including their addresses. But if you have any issues, please feel free to reach out to the MCTTD team. All right. So one of the main components of our spring regional meetings will be focusing on these endocrinology posters. So for the POs on the call that have participating endocrinology practices that participated in the partnership projects, we've done some aggressive emailing, so hopefully you're all familiar. But one of the requirements for those specialty practices, specifically nephrology or endocrinology, excuse me, is the partnership project posters, and making sure that they have all completed and sent those in. We are past the deadline for their submission. However, if there are practices that have not sent in their posters yet, we can accept them up till March 14th, which is the end of this week, but we do need to go to print by the end of this week. So please make sure that your participating endocrinology practices that participated in a partnership project last year have submitted their posters by the end of this week. It'll be a really cool session. We're really excited to share all of the great work that's been done and have our mini MCTTD poster session. All right. Other items on the specialist scorecard. So these are available through the portal. In the admin portal on the left-hand side, you'll see a tab titled SCP Scorecard 25-26. This is where you'll go to be able to locate those. This is for continuing endocrinologists and nephrologists. For those groups, they'll only see their participation measures at this point in time. As a reminder, the performance measure is still forthcoming. That will be available. If it is a new participating endocrinologist or a new participating nephrologist practice, they only have participation measures for their first year. But again, if it's a continuing specialty practice, their performance measure will be coming, but it is not yet out. That'll be up at the end of the month. All right. Our EMR efficiency work group. So this was an idea from a member of the collaborative that we're quite excited about. So this group is going to be focused on talking about ways that the EMR across POs can be leveraged for efficiency within your diabetes workflows. And so we've heard lots of great order sets that POs have put in place, or informational packets that practices have created so that patients can get sent as a part of their after visit summaries. And so this is really the idea behind this, is to really be able to disseminate and share best practices, tips and tricks, especially for POs that may struggle with having multiple different EMRs across their POs. We're hoping to get broad representation from individuals at POs that may deal with different EMR systems. And so if this is something that you're interested in participating in, please let us know by the end of this week. And in the email that you send us, please include what your EMR system is. If you work at a PO level and have multiple, please feel free to list all of those, and also include just kind of what you're hoping to get out of that work group, or what you're hoping to be able to share if you have a best practice or some other tip or trick that you would like to be able to share with the collaborative. All right, so as a reminder, the performance measure reports did become available through the admin portal on February 20th. An email went out to the collaborative on that same day explaining the nuances of those reports. There's a lot of details, so I'm not going to go through them here. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the coordinating center, either Jackie or myself. And then that data was contained through September 30th. And then the major caveat here that we explained with the details, which again, check out that email, was that the data may not match those reports in the dashboard exactly, but they'll be very close. But the source of truth for performance is the reports that we sent out. And I see Kathy, you have your hand up. Yes, please feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, two questions. One is, I just want to verify that if the practice met the performance metric, so they just have to maintain their performance.
Yep.
Is the measurement their baseline performance, or the HEDIS measure, the 70% or the 87%?
I'm not sure I fully understand, but I'm going to try to get through. So the performance measure itself is matching the 70% and the 87% respectively with commercial and Medicare. And so if they're already meeting that is the performance measure. All they have to do is maintain it. It's the baseline was showing where they're at as of that baseline date. And then the progress report that they were just sent last month was an update to their current performance. So assuming they're continuing to meet it. And so it's not that they have to improve. There's not like, if you are meeting it, you have to get better by X%. There's nothing like that. They just have to continue meeting it and then simultaneously submit those 5 uncontrolled patient A1C forms, which was the other aspect of that performance measure. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I thought that was the case, but it's always good to not assume.
Yep, absolutely.
And then the second question I have is, when I'm looking at the MDC dashboard data,
yep.
I have patients that are showing that have no A1C value in the dashboard data, but are counting as controlled when I look at the data.
Counting as controlled in the baseline reports that we sent you?
No, if you look at the data, like let's say the denominator is 225. You've got your numerator is all your controlled patients with an A1C that's commercial less than 8. And then you have your uncontrolled, but I have very few, a handful, that there's no value, but they're counting in the numerator as controlled.
Well, I suppose that's a good thing for your practices, but that is interesting. If you're able to send me a couple of examples of those, that would be really helpful. And I could take a peek at those patients specifically.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Awesome. All right. So the future reports and the data enhancements are listed here. So the dashboard, the patient data dashboard data will be refreshed again this month. So at the end of the month, and that data will go through January 2025. The next refresh will be in April with the data through February 2025. In April, we'll also be sending out the next of the progress reports. So it'll be very, very similar. It'll look exactly the same as the progress reports you just received last month, with data that will go through January 31st. And then finally in June, the data will be refreshed again with data through April 2025. And then we'll also be sending out the final of the push progress reports in July, or very beginning of July, ideally the beginning of July, with data through May 2025, depending on when we get that refresh in June. So that final report in July will be the final scorecard report. Any other questions on this before I move on?
Hey Jake, it's Peggy
Yep.
Besk.
Hey, Peggy.
Hey Jake, so with the data releases will come updated patient lists also, correct?
Patient lists in the dashboard. So we're not
In the
sending out
dashboard.
we're not sending out patient lists like the baseline one every progress report. So the progress reports is what you get sent with the bolded sub bullets here. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. So the February 2025 progress report sent. That'll be identical to what you just received in February, which did not have patient lists, but it had the progress. And same for April and same for July. The patient lists are what's available through the dashboard in the performance measure area. And I know that you and I met a couple weeks ago, Peggy, where I walked you through how to find that. And so that'll be continue to be where you'll want to find that.
Okay, so it's one patient list. We're just going to get data now. Okay.
You're just going to get practice level reports, and the patient list is through the dashboard now. Yep.
Okay,
And
thank you.
if you have a practice that's there's only a handful of practices that weren't meeting the performance measure, but if you have a practice that wasn't or isn't meeting the performance measure, you can use both the dashboard as well as the baseline reports that were sent out in September that had those patient lists. Then go and find any patients that, as of the baseline, were not well controlled or were not meeting the measure, and then look them up in your own EMR, which is going to be your source of truth anyway, because we have the data lag. And so we'll eventually get their most recent A1Cs, but that may be another option for you to say, okay, this patient had a A1C of 9.2 at baseline. But I go and look up John Smith now in my EMR, and he's showing as a 6.8 or a 7 point whatever. And so I now know that that patient's well controlled. And so maybe I move on to the next patient in my area of focus. Does that make sense?
It does. And another quick question. So if I
Yeah.
have a practice who's measured in the aggregate group that is not meeting one of the measures, like
Yep.
say I have a patient who, is not meeting the 80% or, whatever for Medicare.
Yep.
So they're still going to be measured in the aggregate though, right? So it depends on what that group of practices comes out with ultimately.
Yeah, so the rationale behind the aggregate group was really a statistical consideration. If you have a practice with a very small N number, whatever that cause is, if it's data or data discrepancies or what have you, the practice is disadvantaged by a small number of patients in their total count, because a group of patients that are not well controlled could skew their performance quite significantly. And so that was the idea behind putting them in an aggregate group, so that they could work together. So it doesn't mean that like you have to have all patients from each practice controlled. You can work across, if it's an aggregate group of 5 practices, all 5 practices, to just get as many of those patients controlled as possible, to be able to bump up that aggregate group's total performance, rather than having to focus on one specific practice's list of maybe 3 or 4 patients, which would be more difficult. You have a broader selection.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So our next learning community event we're really excited about is going to be on incretin mimetics, or the GLP-1 GIP receptor agonists, focusing on the incretin mimetic nutritional considerations and more. That'll be led by an endocrinologist, Dr. Andrew Crafson. That is coming up at the end of the month on Friday, March 28th, and that'll be a lunch session from 12 to 1. It'll cover muscle wasting, dehydration, disordered eating, and other topics associated with managing diet while on incretin mimetics. All right, so we wanted to talk a little bit about the enhancements that are going to be made to the patient data dashboard and the upcoming March enhancement. So we have 3 enhancements of differing sizes, illustrated here by the font sizes. So the smallest of the enhancements here is the 2025 diabetes medication update. So any meds that were added to the HEDIS diabetes list for 2025 have been added. So those are new formulations of GLPs, SGLT2s, all of that. As a reminder, because this is a question we get all the time, GLPs that are marketed or labeled, I should say, specifically for weight loss are not included. So, for example, Wegovy and Saxenda are not included in the dashboard just because they're a GLP. So that is something to keep in mind. But if it is Ozempic, that will be listed in there, or a new formulation of Ozempic. The other enhancement is the displaying of symbols in numerical lab values for eGFR. So we know that labs have different ways of reporting eGFR. A lot of them, if a patient has a normal eGFR, may report it as greater than 60 or greater than 90, depending on the sensitivity of the lab. Previously, those symbols were dropped and only the numerical value was reported, or in some cases, that value could have been completely null. If the value was greater than 90, for example, it could be reported as null rather than actually showing 90, which is obviously not ideal. So an update has been made to show that greater than operand sign or less than sign. And then another area where this could be an issue, which we're continuing to work on, is with regards to urine albumin and urine creatinine ratio. We know that oftentimes urine albumin is reported as a less than 6, which results in an uncalculatable urine albumin creatinine ratio. So that's something that we're continuing to work on, but that'll be a little bit more complicated because there's a bunch of different possible reporting for that. And so that'll be in a future enhancement as well. And then the big one for March that we're really excited about is the addition of endocrinologist attribution. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what that looks like. And that's been a long time coming. So what we have here is how we're going to be attributing endocrinologists to patients within the patient data dashboard for the purpose of their participation in MCTTD. So broadly, there are 2 attribution models that are used within the dashboard. One is MCTTD specific attribution model that utilizes claims from Blue Cross Blue Shield and Blue Care Network. Prior to us having all payer PPQC data, that was the only attribution model that was used because it was the only subset of patients that we had data for. Now, with the integration of all payer PPQC data, we have to have an attribution model that does not rely on claims from Blue Cross Blue Shield and BCN, obviously. And so there's 2 models. And the second one then is this ACRES, or the active care relationship attribution model. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between these 2 in the next couple of slides. But the major thing with this enhancement to understand is that endocrinologists will now have access to patients in the patient data dashboards and will be able to access or request access to the MCTTD patient data dashboards. And this is what's going to really enable us to be able to launch performance measures for specialists in the future, including endocrinologists, like we will be for nephrologists. So we'll talk a little bit about what these attributions models look like. The first here is the MCTTD attribution model. This is going to be specific to the utilization of Blue Cross and Blue Care Network claims. And so the idea behind this was developed in partnership with many of your participating endocrinologists. We held informational sessions actually over a year ago now, and feedback sessions to kind of get to the most appropriate patient subset as possible. And so what this ended up looking like is that a patient has to see the specialist, the endocrinologist, on 2 or more occasions in an ambulatory care setting within 2 years, with the most recent visit having occurred in the last 395 days, basically saying 1 year plus a 30-day buffer. And then the second aspect of that is both of those visits had to have either a primary or secondary billing diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, with at least one of those 2 visit diagnoses being primary for type 2 diabetes. The idea behind this, and what we consistently heard from your endocrinologists, was that we see patients that have type 2 diabetes for whom we don't manage their diabetes. And we wanted to make sure that we were only attributing patients when appropriate. So if a patient sees an endocrinologist for Hashimoto's, but their primary care doctor manages their type 2 diabetes in its entirety, that patient would not be appropriate to attribute to this endocrinologist for the purposes of MCTTD. So that is how this was designed. The details of this will be specifically, as I mentioned, looking at Blue Cross and BCN claims to determine that relationship. And this will ensure that they were at least attributed to the PO. So here, this ensures that we are at least attributed BCBSM, BCN patients if a PO has not agreed to share all payer data with MCTTD. So what this is saying is that if your PO has not sign that letter to participate in the all-payer PPQC use case, this will allow for at least the Blue Cross BCN patients to be attributed to your participating endocrinologists. Patients who see an endocrinologist once are not attributed to them. That's important. And for the purposes of measuring type 2 diabetes performance and assigning VBR, we really felt like that was necessary to make sure that they had an ongoing relationship with that provider. All right. The last thing here is that a provider assigned to a patient using this specific model will be referred to in the patient data dashboard as that patient's endocrinologist. We have specialty type associated with Blue Cross and BCN claims. And so we will be able to determine that provider's specialty. That will differ from this next model, which is why I'm calling it out. So the Active Care Relationship Service is a system that you as the PO submit a file to MyHIN, if you're not familiar, to the Michigan Health Information Network, saying our provider, Dr. Smith, has a relationship with Jane Smith or whatever. And this is an active, ongoing provider-patient relationship. So MCTTD, MDC has nothing to do with creating this relationship. This comes directly from you as the PO to MyHIN that is then passed along to MDC and then utilized for the purpose of the dashboard. So it's important to understand that each PO controls the criteria with which they use to generate that relationship and put it into their ACRS files. It differs across POs. It's at their sole discretion. The ACRS file that MyHIN receives then are passed along to MDC for each PO that signed that letter participating in the all-payer PPQC use case. And then MDC uses those files to attribute patients to those providers that PO is saying have an active relationship with. Thus, patients will be attributed to endocrinologists in your PO if your PO has stated that in its ACRS file that this is a given patient-provider relationship. One of the limitations of ACRS is that ACRS does not specify provider type. So we won't necessarily be able to state with definitive proof that a provider is an endocrinologist. So therefore, they will just be listed as a patient's provider. We don't have the ability to say this is an endocrinologist, this is a nephrologist, this is a primary care, if the only attribution we're receiving is from ACRS. The other important caveat here that we have received a couple of questions on is a MyHIN policy that MDC doesn't really have any control over is that MyHIN considers ACRS files active for 90 days. And so even if your PO is submitting an ACRS file every single day to MyHIN, it will look at all 90 of them for the period of 90 days, and then on a rolling basis kind of expire the oldest one. And so this is where you may see attribution not change overnight. If you have a patient attributed to a provider, and then on the next day that patient's removed from your ACRS file, it will take 90 days for that patient to fall off of that attribution. So that's just something important to realize. It will eventually happen. It's not going to continue on in perpetuity just because they were attributed on one historical ACRS file, but it will take 90 days. This was a lot. I'm going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions or clarifications. These slides obviously are sent out, and this is not the last we'll talk about this, but if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute. All right. Switching gears here. This is a project that we're exploring with Michigan 211. And one of the things that we wanted to look into was whether or not you as the POs felt there would be value in a project specifically looking at putting up referrals to 211 via your EMR systems. And so if this project does move forward, this would be something that we would potentially task the EMR efficiency work group with advising on as well. But we do want to understand some of your PO's previous dealings or experiences working with Michigan 211. So just kind of keep a lookout for an email in the next couple of weeks from us at the coordinating center. If you're able to respond to that survey, it'll be really short. We're estimating 5 minutes or so, just kind of giving us some feedback on previous work that you've done with 211 or any benefits or limitations you feel that there may be, so that we can better assign our team's bandwidth in determining whether or not this is a project that may be of value to the POs or not. All right. With that, there will be no April PO calls as per usual because of the spring regional meetings. And so we will be sending out cancellations for the April PO calls here within the week. And if there is anything that comes up during April that you have questions on, please feel free as always to reach out to us and we will get back to you as soon as possible. We have about 5 minutes or so before the half hour. If there's any questions, please feel free to come off mute and let me know. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to the email team after.
Hi, Jake. This is Anna. I'm from HVPA. I was just wondering if anything came out about nephrology posters. There's a on the dashboard, it says like nephrology outcomes reporting, but I haven't seen anything. And it said I had a March 1st, 2025 due date.
Yeah, so that's what we were talking about here, Anna. So you haven't seen any emails at all
Not
about
for
this?
nephrology.
Or nephrology, sorry. For endocrinology. So there's no posters for nephrology. There's only posters for endocrinology.
Okay, because on the dashboard main page, there is like a PCP partnership final outcomes.
Yes, that was reporting at the nephrology clinical champions meeting. But there is no posters associated with that are due for
Okay.
nephrology for the spring regional meetings.
I'm interested to know why that isn't met.
I will look into that specifically
Thank
and
you.
get back to you. Let me make a note.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yep, absolutely. I just saw a chat. Does somebody know that Inhale was a meeting today? Maybe I missed that. Okay, do the regionals this month. Is there anybody from Inhale on the call? To make sure before I end things. I don't think so. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the regional meetings. There was a question in the chat from about the keychain. So, great question. We have had a shipping nightmare with the low carb diet keychains. It has been the bane of our existence. So I deeply apologize for the delay in this. We are going to just distribute them at the regional meetings now because we never received our samples. They are on the back of a truck somewhere, just moving around the country. And so we're going to just distribute them at the regional meetings because we were never able to get the samples to you guys in time to place the orders. So I do apologize for that. Yeah. Oh, Lauria just we finally have them in hand, which is great. But we did go ahead and just place the order for the full set, rather than waiting until we got those samples because, like I say, it's been a nightmare. Thanks, Lauria. Any other questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'll stay on.
Hey, Jake, what is your contact email?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat for you. You got a question?
Nope, that was it.
Okay. It's in the chat there.